in the fog-choked gloom of a London night. A desperate knock at Baker Street heralds a chilling mystery. Lord Arthur Saltire, the young heir to the Duke of Holdernesse, has vanished from the Priory School, his bed empty, his fate unknown. Was it a child's whim, or a sinister plot cloaked in the storm-swept moor? Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson plunge into the desolate Mackleton moor, where bicycle tracks and a bloodied watch lead to a murdered schoolmaster and a trail of secrets buried in the shadows of Holdernesse Hall. But as the truth unravels, a darker motive emerges, a betrayal born of envy and blood ties, threatening to shatter a noble house. Will Holmes unmask the culprit before the moor claims its final secret? Chapter 1. The unexpected visitor. It was in the autumn of 1895, when the fogs of London wrapped Baker Street in their clammy embrace, that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves in one of those rare interludes of repose that punctuated our otherwise eventful lives. The fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow across the cluttered room, where papers, chemical apparatus, and the detritus of Holmes's manifold inquiries lay scattered in a chaos only he could navigate. I sat in my accustomed armchair, the evening edition of the Times spread across my lap, its columns filled with the usual fare of political squabbles and society gossip. Holmes, meanwhile, lounged upon the settee, his long fingers coaxing a plaintive melody from his Stradivarius, the notes weaving through the air like threads of thought too intricate for speech. The hour was approaching 9, and the city outside. Our windows had settled into a muted hum, broken only by the occasional clatter of a hansom cab or the cry of a late vendor. I had just turned to an article on the recent unrest in the Balkans when a sharp, insistent rap at the door shattered the evening's tranquility. Mrs. Hudson, ever the guardian of our domestic peace, appeared moments later, her face betraying a mixture of curiosity and mild indignation at the lateness of the hour. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone suggesting she found the visitor's urgency somewhat irregular. "He insists it is a matter of the gravest importance." Holmes set down his violin with a languid motion, his eyes glinting with the first spark of interest I had seen in days. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," he said, rising to his feet and brushing a speck of ash from his dressing gown. "The night promises to be less tedious than I had feared." The man who entered was a figure of considerable presence, though his countenance bore the unmistakable marks of distress. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a frock coat of impeccable cut, yet his face, framed by a mane of silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, was ashen, and his eyes darted with a nervous energy that belied his otherwise dignified bearing. In his hand he clutched a heavy walking stick, its silver head gleaming faintly in the lamplight, and his breath came in short, uneven gasps, as though he had hurried through the fog-choked streets to reach us. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice tremulous but resonant, carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "I am he," Holmes replied, gesturing to a chair. "And this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. Pray, be seated, and tell us what brings you here at such an hour." The visitor sank into the chair, his hands gripping the arms as though to steady himself. "My name is Dr. Thornycroft Huxtable," he began, "headmaster of the Priory School in Mackleton, a preparatory institution of some renown in the north of England. I come to you, Mr. Holmes, because a calamity has befallen, sir, calamity that threatens not only the reputation of my school, but the very heart of one of the noblest families in the land." Holmes leaned forward, his lean frame taut with attention, his eyes narrowing as they fixed upon Huxtable's face. "Speak," plainly, sir," he said. "What is the nature of this calamity?" Huxtable drew a deep breath, as though steeling himself. "It concerns Lord Arthur Saltire, the only son of the Duke of Holdernesse. The boy, who is but 10 years of age, has vanished from the school. He was last seen in his dormitory last night at 9 o'clock, when the housemaster made his rounds. This morning, his bed was found empty, his belongings untouched, and no trace of him could be found within the school or its grounds." I felt a chill at the words, for the disappearance of a child, especially one of such lineage, carried implications both tragic and sinister. Holmes, however, betrayed no emotion, his face a mask of cold calculation. "When was the boy discovered?" "Missing?" he asked. "At 6 this morning," Huxtable replied. "The housemaster, Mr. Pritchard, noticed the boy's absence during the morning call. We searched the dormitories, the classrooms, the outbuildings even, the surrounding woods, but found nothing. The local constabulary has been informed, but they are ill-equipped for such a matter. The Duke himself urged me to seek your aid, Mr. Holmes, for he places great faith in your reputation." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. A gesture, I knew, signaled the rapid workings of his mind. "Describe the boy," he said, "and the circumstances of the night. Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." Huxtable nodded, his hands twisting the head of his walking stick as he spoke. "Lord Arthur is a slight lad, fair-haired, with a delicate constitution but a quick mind. He is sensitive, perhaps overly so for a boy of his years, but spirited and well-liked by his peers. The Priory School is situated on the edge of the Mackleton moor, a vast and desolate tract, and our buildings are surrounded by high walls to ensure the safety of our pupils. Last night, a storm swept through the region, fierce winds and heavy rain, which made the grounds treacherous. The dormitories are locked at night, and the windows are barred, yet no signs of forced entry were found. The boy's bed was neatly made, as though he had never slept in it, and his clothes, books, and personal effects were undisturbed. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a peculiar intensity. And the staff, the other boys, has anyone reported anything unusual? Nothing of note, Huxtable said, though his voice faltered slightly. The boys were questioned, but they saw nothing. The staff, too, reported an uneventful night, save for the storm. The only oddity, perhaps, is that one of our masters, Herr Heidegger, the German tutor, was absent from his quarters this morning. He is a solitary man, often taking long rides on his bicycle across the moor, and we assumed he had gone out early. But his absence, coupled with the boys, has caused some unease. Holmes's brow arched, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A bicycle, you say? Most interesting. And what of the Duke? What is his state of mind? Huxtable's face darkened. His Grace is distraught, as you might imagine. Lord Arthur is his only heir, and the Duchess, who is in frail health, has been confined to her chambers since the boy's birth. The Duke fears for her sanity should any harm come to the child. He has offered a substantial reward for information, leading to Arthur's return. But I fear the matter is more complex than a simple runaway. Holmes rose, his movements swift and purposeful. Very well, Dr. Huxtable. Watson, pack your bag. We shall take the first train to Mackleton in the morning. The game is afoot, and I suspect it is one of no small consequence. Huxtable's relief was palpable, though his hands still trembled as he rose. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I shall arrange for a carriage to meet you at Mackleton Station. The Duke has placed his resources at your disposal, As Huxtable departed, I turned to Holmes, who was already pacing the room, his mind evidently racing. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. "A kidnapping, perhaps? Or could the boy have wandered off?" Holmes paused, his silhouette sharp against the firelight. "The absence of forced entry is suggestive, Watson. A boy of 10 does not vanish from a locked dormitory without purpose, his own or another's. The storm may have masked sounds or tracks, but it also complicates the movements of any abductor. And this Herr Heidegger, his absence is no coincidence. A bicycle leaves a trail, even in a storm, and trails are my specialty." He crossed to the window, peering into the fog. "The Duke's involvement, too, warrants scrutiny. A man of his station has enemies, and a child is a vulnerable target. Yet there is something in Huxtable's manner, hesitation, perhaps, suggests not all is as it seems. We shall see what the moor reveals." I retired to my room to prepare for the journey, my mind heavy with the image of a frightened boy lost in the wilds of the moor. Holmes, I knew, would sleep little that night, his thoughts already weaving a web to ensnare the truth. As I packed my revolver and a few essentials, I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking on a case that would test even Holmes's formidable powers. The night passed in a haze of anticipation, and by dawn we were aboard the express. Train rattling northward through a landscape of rolling hills and mist-shrouded valleys. Holmes sat opposite me, his eyes half closed, his mind no doubt racing through a labyrinth of possibilities. I attempted to engage him in conversation, but he waved me off with a curt gesture, his attention fixed on some inner calculation. Mackleton Station was a small, windswept platform, its solitude broken only by the arrival of a sleek carriage bearing the crest of Holdernesse. The driver, a taciturn man with a weathered face, informed us that the Duke awaited us at the school. As we clattered along the rutted road, the Priory School came into view, a brooding edifice of grey stone, its towers rising like sentinels against the bleak moorland. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and heather, and a chill wind tugged at my coat. As though warning of the secrets that lay ahead, we were ushered into the headmaster's study, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and portraits of stern-faced scholars. The Duke of Holdernesse stood by the window, his tall frame stooped with anxiety. His features were aquiline, his hair streaked with grey, and his eyes held a depth of sorrow that belied his aristocratic composure. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending a hand, "your reputation precedes you. My son, my only son, is lost to me. I beg you to find him." Holmes inclined his head. "I shall require access to the boys' dormitory, the grounds, and any witnesses. No detail is too small, Your Grace." The Duke nodded, his voice low. "You shall have whatever you need, but I warn you, the moor is a treacherous place, and time is against us." As we left the study to begin our investigation, Holmes's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a glint of determination. The disappearance of Lord Arthur Saltire was no mere accident, and I knew that Holmes would leave no stone unturned until the boy was found or the truth, however dark, was laid bare. The dormitory was our first stop, a long, low room with rows of narrow beds, each neatly made. Lord Arthur's bed stood by a window overlooking the moor, its bars intact, its latch secure. Holmes examined the floor, the walls, the window frame, his magnifying glass glinting in the dim light. "No scratches, no marks of a jemmy," he murmured. "The boy did not leave by force, nor was he taken by an outsider through this window." He knelt by the bed, his fingers brushing the counterpane. The bed is undisturbed, as Huxtable said. Yet the boy was seen at 9. Either he never slept here, or he left willingly before retiring. I glanced at the window, the moor beyond. A sea of shadow and mist. Could he have climbed out? I ventured. Holmes shook his head. The bars are too close, and the drop is 20 feet onto soft earth. There would be marks, Watson, and there are none. No, the answer lies elsewhere. We moved to the grounds, where the storm's aftermath had left the earth sodden and treacherous. Holmes paced the perimeter of the school, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of passage. Near the stable, he paused, crouching to examine a patch of mud. Here, he said, pointing to a faint impression. A bicycle tied on lop, by. The pattern, fresh, despite the rain. This may be our first thread. The stable housed a dozen bicycles, one of which, we were told, belonged to Herr Heidegger. Its absence was confirmed by the groundskeeper, Reuben Hayes, a grizzled man with a surly demeanor. Herr Heidegger rides it most days, he said, scratching his beard. Odd he's not back. He's a queer one, always off on his own. Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. Indeed. And where does Herr Heidegger reside? A cottage, a mile off, by the moor's edge, Hayes replied. You'll find naught there, though. He's a private sort. As we set out for the cottage, the moor stretched before us, vast and desolate, its heather swaying in the wind. The cottage was a squat, stone building, its windows dark, its hearth cold. Holmes circled it, noting the absence of tracks, save for a single set of tire marks leading into the moor. He rode from here last night, Holmes said, and the weight suggests he was not alone. The plot thickens, Watson. We followed the tracks until they faded into the sodden earth, the moor swallowing them as it did all traces of human passage. Holmes stood silent, his eyes sweeping the horizon. There is a public house, the Red Bull, 2 miles hence, he said at length. It is a place where tongues may loosen. Come, Watson, we have work to do. The Red Bull was a low, smoky inn, its patrons a mix of shepherds and labourers huddled over their pints. The landlord, a stout man with a ruddy face, confirmed that a man matching Heidegger's description had passed through the previous night, accompanied by a cloaked figure, whose face he could not see. They took the road toward Holdernesse Hall, he said, but the storm was fierce, and I thought it odd they'd travel in such weather. Holmes thanked him, his mind already turning to the next step. As we stepped back into the cold, he turned to me, his voice low. The boy was taken, Watson, but not by force. The absence of struggle, the bicycle, the cloaked figure, all point to a plan, but whose, and why? The Duke's secrets may hold the key, and I intend to uncover them. The day was waning, and the moor grew darker, its shadows lengthening like fingers reaching for the truth. I felt a growing unease, not only for the fate of young Lord Arthur, but for the tangled web of motives that Holmes was beginning to unravel. As we made our way back to the school, I knew that the coming days would test Holmes's genius as few cases had before. Chapter 2. The Journey Norther. First rays of dawn had scarcely pierced the fog that clung to London's streets when Sherlock Holmes and I boarded the early express bound for Mackleton. The platform at King's Cross was a study in contrasts. Porters bustling with luggage, newsboys hawking their wares, and the occasional weary traveller wrapped in a muffler against the autumn chill. Holmes, clad in his Inverness cape and deerstalker, cut a striking figure as he strode toward the carriage, his eyes alight with the restless energy that always accompanied the scent of a new case. I followed, my medical bag slung over one shoulder, my mind still, turning over the disturbing details of Dr. Huxtable's visit the previous night. We settled into a first-class compartment, the plush seats a small comfort against the long journey ahead. The train whistle shrieked, and with a lurch, we were off. The city's grime giving way to the patchwork fields and wooded hills of the countryside. Holmes sat opposite me, his lean frame silhouetted against the window, where mist curled like ghostly fingers against the glass. He had brought a small valise, from which he now produced a map of the Mackleton region, spreading it across his knees with the precision of a general plotting a campaign. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "the moorland around Mackleton is a singular landscape, wild, treacherous, and sparsely populated. If young Lord Arthur Saltire is there, whether by choice or compulsion, it will not be a simple matter to find him. The storm last night will have obliterated many traces, but not all. We must be vigilant." I nodded, though his words did little to ease the disquiet that had settled in my chest. "Do you suspect foul play, Holmes? Or could the boy have run away?" Holmes's lips twitched in a faint, enigmatic smile. "A boy of 10, the heir to a dukedom, does not vanish from a locked dormitory without purpose. The absence of forced entry, the undisturbed bed, the storms timing these are not the hallmarks of a childish whim. No, Watson, there is design here, and I suspect it reaches beyond the walls of the Priory School." He returned to his map, his finger tracing the contours of the moor. "The school lies here," he said, pointing to a spot near the edge of a vast, shaded expanse. To the north, Holdernesse Hall, the Duke's estate. To the west, the village of Mackleton, and beyond, the moor stretches for miles, broken only by scattered farms and the Red Bull in the bicycle tracks we learned of last night will be our starting point. But we must also consider the human elements, the Duke, the school staff, this Herr Heidegger. Each is a thread in the tapestry. The train rattled on, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Holmes's low, measured voice. I attempted to draw him out further, but he waved me off, his attention absorbed by the map and the occasional glance out the window, where the landscape grew wilder with each passing mile. The fields gave way to rolling hills, then to the bleak, wind-swept moorland that seemed to brood under a sky heavy with clouds. I felt a growing sense of isolation, as though we were venturing into a realm where civilization held but a tenuous grip. At Mackleton Station, a small, wind-swept platform greeted us, its single lamppost flickering in the morning gloom. A carriage, bearing the crest of Holdernesse, awaited, its driver a taciturn man with a face weathered by years on the moor. "The Duke sent me," he said gruffly, taking our bags. "You're to go straight to the Priory School." The road to the school wound through a landscape of stark beauty, the heather and gorse stretching endlessly under a sky that threatened rain. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth, and the wind carried a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo the gravity of our mission. Holmes sat beside me, his eyes scanning the terrain with the intensity of a hawk, noting every detail of the ruts in the road, the distant silhouette of a shepherd, the faint gleam of a stream cutting through. The more the Priory School came into view as we crested a rise, its grey stone towers rising like a fortress against the desolate backdrop. Its walls, ivy-clad and weathered, spoke of centuries of learning, yet there was an air of foreboding about the place, as though it guarded secrets older than its foundation. The carriage drew up before the main entrance, where Dr. Huxtable awaited, his face drawn with fatigue but his manner as courteous as ever. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, clasping our hands. "I cannot express my gratitude. The Duke is here, and he is eager to meet you." We were led through a vaulted hall, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced headmasters, to a study where the Duke of Holdernesse stood by a roaring fire. He was a man of imposing presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with the aquiline features of his lineage, but his eyes were shadowed with a grief that no title could shield. His hand, when he offered it, trembled slightly, and his voice was low, almost hoarse. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "you are my last hope. My son, Arthur, is everything to me. His mother, she cannot bear this loss. Find him, I beg you, and name your price." Holmes's gaze was steady, his tone calm but firm. "I require no reward, your grace, save the truth. Tell me of your son, your household, and any who might wish you harm." The Duke sank into a chair, his hands clasped tightly. "Arthur is a delicate boy, sensitive but bright, with a mind far beyond his years. He has been at the Priory School for 2 terms, and we have had no cause for concern until now. As for enemies, my position attracts envy, as you might imagine, but I know of no one who would stoop to such a deed. My household is loyal, my staff discreet, yet I cannot shake the fear that this is no accident." Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he detected a note of evasion in the Duke's words. "And the Duchess, how does she fare?" The Duke's face tightened. "She is unwell, confined to her chambers at Holdernesse Hall. Arthur's disappearance has worsened her condition. I have kept the details from her, but she senses something is amiss." Holmes rose, his movements brisk. "I shall need to see the boys' dormitory, the grounds, and any staff who were present last night. Dr. Huxtable, you will accompany us." The dormitory was as Huxtable had described, a long, low room with rows of beds, each neatly made, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and wax. Lord Arthur's bed stood by a barred window overlooking the moor, its counterpane smooth, as though untouched. Holmes examined every inch bed, floor, walls, window frame, his magnifying glass catching the faint light. No signs of struggle, he murmured. No scratches on the bars, no ladder marks below. The boy did not leave by force, nor was he taken through this window. He turned to Huxtable. "The storm, how severe was it?" "Fierce," Huxtable replied. "Winds strong enough to shake the shutters, rain that turned the grounds to mud. It began around 8 and lasted until midnight." Holmes's eyes gleamed. A convenient cloak for movement, yet a challenge for tracks. "We shall see what remains." We proceeded to the grounds, where the earth was still soft from the storm. Holmes paced the perimeter, his gaze fixed on the ground, until he paused near the stable. "Here," he said, crouching. "A bicycle tire Dunlop, fresh, despite the rain. This belongs to Herr Heidegger, I presume." Huxtable nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yes, he uses it often. His absence this morning is troubling, though he is known to ride early." Holmes's smile was thin. "We shall visit his cottage next. A solitary man with a bicycle is a figure of interest in such a case." The cottage, a mile off, was a squat stone building, its windows dark and its chimney cold. Holmes circled it, noting a single set of tire tracks leading into the moor. "He rode last night," he said, "and the depth suggests a second rider or a burden. This is no coincidence, Watson." As we prepared to follow the tracks, the moor stretched before us, vast and unforgiving, its heather swaying in the wind. Holmes's face was set, his mind already weaving the threads of evidence into a pattern only he could see. "The game is afoot," he said, his voice low, "and it leads us into the heart of the moor." Chapter 3. The clue of the bicycle. The Mackleton moor stretched before us like a vast, brooding sea, its undulating waves of heather and gorse broken only by jagged outcrops of stone and the occasional twisted thorn. The morning was raw, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint tank of peat, and a thin mist curled about our boots as Sherlock Holmes and I set out from Herr Heidegger's deserted cottage. The bicycle tracks, etched faintly in the sodden ground, had seized Holmes's attention with the tenacity of a hound on a scent, and his lean figure moved with a purposeful stride that belied the treacherous footing of the moor. "Observe, Watson," he said, pausing to crouch beside the tire marks, his magnifying glass glinting in the pale light. "These are Dunlop tires, as I noted at the school, but the depth and spacing suggest a rider of considerable weight or, perhaps, a second passenger. The tracks are fresh, no more than 12 hours old, despite the storm's efforts to erase them. Herr Heidegger, it seems, did not ride alone last night." I peered at the marks, their edges blurred by the rain but still discernible in the soft earth. Could it be the boy? I asked, my mind conjuring the image of young Lord Arthur, slight and fair, borne away on a bicycle through the tempest. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Possible, but unlikely. A boy of 10 would add little weight to the machine. No, Watson. I suspect a more complex design. The absence of Heidegger, coupled with these tracks, points to a deliberate act. We must follow them. The trail led us deeper into the moor, where the ground grew boggier, sucking at our boots with each step. The wind, ever present, carried a low moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself, and I felt a growing unease, as though the moor were a living thing, jealous of its secrets. Holmes, however, was undeterred, his long legs carrying him forward. With the precision of a machine, his eyes fixed on the faint impressions in the soil. At times, the tracks veered sharply, skirting patches of marsh or rocky outcrops, and once or twice they vanished altogether, only to reappear where the ground hardened. "Curious," Holmes murmured, pausing at a point where the tracks swerved toward a narrow path, barely visible amid the heather. The rider was in haste, yet cautious. See how the tires avoid the softer ground, as though the rider knew the moor well. Heidegger, perhaps, or another familiar with these wilds. We pressed on, the path winding through a shallow valley where the mist hung thicker, obscuring the distant hills. After nearly a mile, the tracks led to a patch of flattened grass, where the earth bore signs of disturbance, not the clean lines of a bicycle, but a chaotic scuffing, as though something had been dragged or struggled. Holmes knelt, his fingers brushing the grass, his face taut with concentration. "Here," he said, pointing to a faint smear of mud. The bicycle was set down, perhaps hidden, and this, he plucked a small object from the grass, holding it up to the light. It was a button, brass and tarnished, bearing the faint outline of a crest. "This is no shepherd's trinket, Watson. It belongs to a garment of quality, possibly from the boy's clothing." My heart sank at the implications. "Then he was here," I said. "But what became of him?" Holmes's gaze was grim. The dragging marks suggest he was moved, perhaps against his will. Yet there is no blood, no sign of violence. The boy may yet be alive, but we must act swiftly. He rose, pocketing the button, and followed the disturbed earth to a nearby copse of stunted trees. their branches gnarled by years of wind. There, half concealed by bracken, lay the bicycle, a sturdy machine with Dunlop tires, its frame scratched but intact. Holmes examined it closely, noting a faint smear of grease on the handlebars and a single strand of fair hair caught in the saddle stitching. "Lord Arthur's hair, I wager," he said, carefully preserving the strand in an envelope. "The boy was on this bicycle, Watson, but not as a willing passenger. The grease suggests a second pair of hands, likely Heidegger's, though we cannot yet be certain." I glanced around, the moor's vastness pressing in on all sides. "Where to now, Holmes? The tracks end here." Holmes's eyes scanned the horizon, settling on a faint plume of smoke rising from a distant point. "The Red Bull in lies that way 2 miles hence. It is a gathering place for the Moors, folk shepherds, labourers, and perhaps those with less savoury occupations. If Heidegger or his companion passed through, someone may have seen them." The trek to the Red Bull was arduous, the moors uneven terrain testing my stamina, though Holmes seemed impervious to fatigue. The inn, when we reached it, was a low, stone building, its windows fogged with the breath of its patrons. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ale and tobacco, and a dozen weathered faces turned to regard us with suspicion. The landlord, a burly man with a florid complexion, approached, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "What brings city folk to the Red Bull?" he asked, his tone wary but not hostile. Holmes's smile was disarming. "Information, my good man. We seek a German gentleman, likely a schoolmaster, who may have passed this way last night, perhaps with a companion. He rides a bicycle." The landlord's eyes flickered, and he hesitated before answering. I saw such a man. Tall, thin, with a beard like a goat's. He came in late, during the storm, with another figure-cloaked face hidden. They took a pint, spoke little, and left toward Holdernesse Hall. Queer business, travelling in such weather. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Did they speak at all? Any word of their purpose?" "Not a word," the landlord replied. "The German paid in coin, and they were gone before the clock struck 10. We thanked him and stepped back into the cold, where the moor seemed to watch us with 1,000 unseen eyes." Holmes's face was set, his mind already sifting the new evidence. "The cloaked figure complicates matters," he said. "It may be the boy, concealed to avoid recognition, or another accomplice. Holdernesse Hall is our next destination, Watson. The Duke's household holds answers, whether he knows it or not." As we turned toward the distant silhouette of the hall, its towers barely visible through the mist, I felt the weight of the case pressing heavier. The bicycle, the button, the cloaked figure, all were pieces in a puzzle that Holmes alone seemed poised to solve. Yet the moor, vast and silent, seemed to mock our efforts, its secrets buried deep in its ancient heart. Chapter 4. The trail across the Mackleton moor, with its endless sweep of heather and bog, seemed to breathe a quiet menace as Sherlock Holmes and I set out from the Red Bull Inn, the landlord's words still ringing in our ears. The sky hung low, its clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind carried a chill that cut through my overcoat, as though the moor itself were warning us to turn back. Holmes, however, strode forward with the unerring purpose of a man who saw, not the desolation before him, but a map of clues invisible to lesser eyes. His Inverness cape flapped about his lean frame, and his gaze darted from the ground to the horizon, as if the very earth might whisper its secrets to him. The bicycle tracks, faint but still traceable in the damp soil, had ended at the copse, where we found Herr Heidegger's machine, but Holmes was not content to let the trail die there. He knelt once more beside the patch of flattened grass, his magnifying glass tracing the edges of the disturbance we had noted earlier. "See here, Watson," he said, his voice low but vibrant with intensity. "The grass is crushed in a direction leading westward, toward a ravine not half a mile hence. The marks suggest a struggle, or at least a hurried movement. Someone was dragged from this point." I peered at the ground, where the heather was matted and the earth scored with faint scratches. "Lord Arthur?" I asked, my voice betraying the dread that had taken root in my heart. Holmes's eyes gleamed, but he offered no immediate answer. The button and the hair from the bicycle point to the boy's presence, but the absence of blood or torn clothing is reassuring. He was moved, Watson, but not necessarily harmed. We must follow this new trail. We set off across the moor, the ground growing softer and more treacherous with each step. The path, if it could be called such, was little more than a sheep track winding through clumps of gorse and patches of bog that sucked at our boots. Holmes moved with a cat-like agility, his eyes never straying from the faint signs of passage-broken stems, displaced pebbles, a smear of mud on a stone. The ravine, when we reached it, was a shallow gash in the moor, its sides steep and littered with loose shale. At its base, a trickle of water gleamed dully, reflecting the leaden sky. Holmes descended with care, his long fingers gripping the rocks as he scanned the ground. "Here," he said at length, pointing to a patch of mud where a single, small footprint was preserved, its edges sharp despite the rain. "A child's shoe, Watson. Lord Arthur was here, and recently, but see this." He indicated a deeper impression nearby, the outline of a man's boot, its heel worn unevenly. "Our cloaked figure from the inn, perhaps. The stride suggests haste." I felt a chill that had little to do with the wind. Then the boy was taken this way, but why, and by whom? Holmes's face was grim, his lips a thin line. The why is tied to the Duke, I suspect. As for the who, Herr Heidegger remains our chief enigma. His absence, his bicycle, his knowledge of the moral point to his involvement. Yet the landlord's description of a cloaked companion introduces a second player. We must proceed with caution. The trail led us out of the ravine and onto a higher ridge, where the moor opened into a vast expanse, its contours softened by the mist. Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on a distant point where a faint track diverged toward a cluster of low hills. "There," he said, pointing, "the path leads to a shepherd's hut, if my memory of the map serves. It is a likely place for concealment, far from prying eyes." The journey to the hut was arduous, the moor's uneven terrain testing my endurance. Holmes, however, seemed impervious, his mind wholly absorbed in the chase. The hut, when we reached it, was a crude structure of stone and sod, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Its single door hung ajar, creaking in the wind, and the interior was dark, smelling of damp and decay. Holmes entered first, his revolver drawn, a rare precaution that underscored the gravity of our situation. The hut was empty, save for a rough pallet of straw and a scattering of debris, a broken cup, a tattered blanket, and, in one corner, a scrap of paper, crumpled and stained. Holmes seized it, smoothing it against the wall. It was a page torn from a schoolboy's exercise book, its margin adorned with childish doodles: a ship, a horse, and a crude sketch of a crown. "Lord Arthur's Holmes," said, his voice taut. The ink is fresh, and the doodles match the description of his habits given by Huxtable. He was here, Watson, and not long ago. I scanned the hut, my heart pounding. But where is he now? And why leave such a clue? Holmes pocketed the paper, his eyes sweeping the floor. The clue was not left intentionally. It was dropped, perhaps in haste. See these marks, he pointed to scuffs, in the dirt where the straw had been disturbed. The boy was moved again, likely within the hour. The trail is warm, Watson, but we must be swift. Outside, the tracks resumed, fainter now, leading toward a rocky outcrop that loomed like a sentinel against the sky. Holmes followed them with relentless focus, noting every broken twig and displaced stone. At the outcrop, the trail vanished, swallowed by the hard, unyielding ground. Holmes stood silent for a moment, his face a mask of concentration, then turned, his gaze to the horizon, where the distant towers of Holdernesse Hall were just visible through the haze. The hall is our next step, he said. The Duke's household holds answers, whether he wills it or not. But first, we must return to the school to confirm Heidegger's absence and question the staff further. There is a thread here, Watson, and it is tangled, but I shall unravel it. As we retraced our steps across the moor, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint cry of a curlew, a sound as mournful as the landscape itself. I could not shake the image of young Lord Arthur, alone and frightened, spirited away into this desolate wilderness. Holmes, however, was a beacon of resolve, his mind a steel trap closing around the truth. The moor might hide its secrets, but Sherlock Holmes was its match, and I knew he would not rest until the boy was found. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Duke, the Mackleton Moor, with its bleak expanse of heather and stone, seemed to close in around us as Sherlock Holmes and I made our way back from the shepherd's hut, the faint cry of the curlew fading into the wind. The discovery of Lord Arthur's doodled paper had kindled a spark of hope, but the vanishing trail at the rocky outcrop left a chill in my heart that the raw autumn air only deepened. Holmes, however, moved with the relentless purpose of a man whose mind was already piecing together the fragments of this dark puzzle. His eyes, sharp as a falcon's, scanned the horizon, and I knew he was turning over every detail: the bicycle, the button, the cloaked figure, and now the scrap of paper, searching for the thread that would lead us to young Lord Arthur Saltire. The Priory School loomed ahead, its grey towers stark against the lowering sky as we approached under the gathering dusk. Dr. Huxtable met us at the gate, his face drawn with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Mr. Holmes," he said, wringing his hands, "have you found anything? The Duke has been inquiring after your progress, and I fear his patience wears thin." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "We have found traces, Dr. Huxtable, but the boy remains elusive. I must speak with the Duke at once, and I shall need a list of all staff present last night, particularly those with access to the dormitories." Huxtable nodded, leading us through the school's echoing halls to a carriage that awaited to convey us to Holdernesse Hall. The journey was short but sombre, the road winding through a landscape that seemed to mirror the Duke's own burdened spirit. The hall itself was a fortress of stone and ivy, its windows glowing faintly in the twilight, as though guarding secrets within its ancient walls. We were ushered into a grand study, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow us as we entered. The Duke of Holdernesse stood by a massive fireplace, its flames casting long shadows across his haggard features. He was a man of imposing stature, his aquiline profile softened by grief, and his hands, clasped behind his back, betrayed a slight tremor. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and strained, "I trust you bring news of my son." Holmes seated himself without ceremony, his gaze fixed on the Duke with an intensity that seemed to pierce the man's aristocratic reserve. "I bring questions, Your Grace, which may lead to news. Lord Arthur was taken from the school, likely by bicycle, and traces of his presence have been found on the moor. A cloaked figure, possibly an accomplice, was seen with Herr Heidegger, who is also missing. I must know of any enemies who might wish to strike at you through your son." The Duke's face darkened, and for a moment I thought I detected a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Enemies," he said, his tone measured but guarded. "A man in my position is never without them. Political rivals, envious peers such as the lot of a duke, but none, I believe, would stoop to such villainy as to harm a child." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "And within your household, are there any whose loyalty might be questioned? A servant, perhaps, or a former associate with a grudge?" The Duke hesitated, his gaze drifting to the fire. "My household is loyal," he said at length. "I have no cause to doubt them. My steward, Mr. Wilder, manages my affairs with diligence, and my staff have been with me for years." Holmes's eyes narrowed, as though he sensed a crack in the Duke's composure. "And the Duchess, you mentioned her frailty. Has she enemies of her own, or has her condition affected the household's dynamics?" The Duke's jaw tightened, and his voice took on a defensive edge. "My wife has been confined to her chambers since Arthur's birth. Mr. Holmes, she is too ill to have enemies, and her condition is a private matter. I fail to see its relevance." Holmes's smile was thin, almost imperceptible. "Everything is relevant, Your Grace, until proven otherwise. A boy does not vanish without motive, and motive often lies in the shadows of family. I must also ask about Herr Heidegger. What can you tell me of him?" The Duke's brow furrowed. "He is a German master at the school, recommended by a colleague. In London, quiet, scholarly, with a passion for cycling. I know little else, save that Dr. Huxtable speaks highly of him." Holmes rose, his movements brisk. "Very well. I shall need to speak with your steward, Mr. Wilder, and any staff who frequent the moor. Watson, we returned to the school to confirm Heidegger's absence and examine his quarters. As we left the study, I caught a fleeting glance from the Duke, mixture of fear and something deeper, perhaps guilt. Holmes, too, noticed it, for he whispered as we stepped into the hall, "The Duke is withholding something, Watson. His manner betrays a secret, and I suspect it is tied to the heart of this affair." Back at the Priory School, Huxtable provided a list of staff, confirming that Herr Heidegger had not returned. His quarters, a small room in the master's wing, were Spartan but orderly, with books in German and English stacked neatly on a shelf. Holmes examined the room with his usual meticulousness, noting a map of the moor pinned to the wall, its edges worn from frequent handling. He knew the terrain well, Holmes said, tracing a route marked in pencil. "This path leads to the ravine where we found the footprint." Heidegger was no casual cyclist. A desk drawer yielded a photograph of a young woman, her face serious, but comely, with a German inscription on the back. A sister, perhaps, or a fiancée, Holmes mused, slipping it into his pocket. It may prove useful. We questioned the staff, but none reported anything unusual beyond the storm's ferocity. The housemaster, Mr. Pritchard, confirmed seeing Lord Arthur in his bed at 9, and the other boys, roused from their dormitories, offered no clues, their faces pale with the weight of the mystery. As we stepped back into the night, the moor stretched before us, its darkness unbroken save for the distant lights of Holdernesse Hall. Holmes stood silent, his profile sharp against the sky. The Duke's reticence is a clue in itself, he said at length. He fears more than the loss of his son, perhaps a scandal, perhaps a betrayal. The trail leads us back to the moor, Watson. But first, we must learn more of this, Mr. Wilder. His name, mentioned so casually, carries a weight the Duke did not intend. The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain, and I felt the moor's vastness pressing against us, as though it guarded the truth with a jealous hand. Holmes, however, was undaunted, his mind a beacon in the gathering storm. I knew that whatever secrets lay hidden in the Duke's shadow, Sherlock Holmes would drag them into the light. Chapter 6. The German Master's Secret. The Mackleton moor lay shrouded in a twilight gloom as Sherlock Holmes and I retraced our steps from the Priory School, the weight of our discoveries pressing heavily upon us. The scrap of paper with Lord Arthur's doodles, the bicycle hidden in the copse, and the Duke's guarded demeanour had woven a web of intrigue that seemed to tighten with each step. The wind, now sharp with the threat of rain, whipped across the heather, and the distant lights of Holdernesse Hall flickered like willow, the wisps, beckoning yet elusive. Holmes, his Inverness cape billowing, moved with the relentless focus of a man who sensed the truth lying just beyond his grasp, his eyes scanning the terrain with an intensity that belied the fatigue of our long day. We returned to the copse, where we had found Herr Heidegger's bicycle, its Dunlop tires still caked with mud from the previous night's storm. Holmes knelt beside it once more, his magnifying glass tracing the frames, scratches, and the faint smear of grease on the handlebars. "This machine tells a story, Watson," he said, his voice low but vibrant with purpose. "The grease is fresh, applied by hands other than the rider's, perhaps in haste. And this," he pointed to a faint scratch on the pedal, where a speck of red paint clung. "Not a common hue for a bicycle. It suggests contact with another object, possibly a vehicle or a gate." I frowned, peering at the mark. A gate on the moor, or could it be from the school? Holmes shook his head. "The school's gates are iron, unpainted. This paint is vibrant, likely from a private estate or a cart used by a local. We shall keep it in mind." He rose, his gaze sweeping the surrounding heather. "The dragging marks we noted earlier lead toward a ravine. We must follow them, for they may hold the key to Heidegger's role in this affair." The trail, faint but discernible in the fading light, wound through a maze of gorse and stone, descending into a shallow ravine where the air was damp and heavy with the scent of moss. Holmes moved with care, his eyes darting from the ground to the rocky walls, noting every displaced pebble and broken stem. At the ravine's base, he paused, his fingers brushing a patch of mud where a second child's footprint lay, its edges softened but unmistakable. "Lord Arthur, again," he said, his voice taut. And here he pointed to a deeper impression, the outline of a man's boot, its sole worn smooth. "Our cloaked figure, perhaps, or Heidegger himself. The stride suggests urgency, but no violence." I felt a surge of hope mingled with dread. "Then the boy is alive." Holmes's face was grim. "Alive? Yes, but in peril. The absence of blood is encouraging, but the haste of these tracks speaks of a plan interrupted or accelerated." He straightened, his gaze fixed on a narrow ledge above the ravine, where a scrap of cloth fluttered, caught on a thorn. He climbed to it with the agility of a mountaineer, retrieving the fragmented piece of fine wool, grey and monogrammed with the initials A.S. "Lord Arthur's," I said, my heart sinking. "He was here, Holmes, but where has he been?" "Taken." Holmes tucked the cloth into an envelope, his eyes narrowing. "The monogram confirms it. The boy was carried or led from the copse to this ravine, likely under cover of the storm. Heidegger's involvement is certain, but his absence suggests either flight or foul play. We must find his destination." The trail led us out of the ravine and onto a windswept ridge, where the moor stretched unbroken save for a distant cluster of low hills. Holmes paused, his map unfolded in his hands, its edges fluttering in the wind. "There," he said, pointing to a spot marked with a faint pencil line. "A track leads to an old quarry, abandoned but sheltered. It is a plausible hiding place, far from the school's prying eyes." The journey to the quarry was a test of endurance, the moor's terrain growing ever more treacherous as the light failed. The quarry, when we reached it, was a gaping wound in the earth, its sides pitted with years of excavation, its floor littered with broken stone and rusted tools. Holmes circled its perimeter, his lantern casting long shadows that danced like spectres across the rocks. At the quarry's edge, he stopped, his light illuminating a pile of fresh earth. Hastily turned, as though to conceal something. "Careful, Watson," he said, drawing his revolver. He knelt, brushing away the soil to reveal a bundle of clothing, garments, neatly folded but stained with mud. "Lord Arthur's, I wager," he said, examining a jacket with the Priory School's crest. "Left here to mislead or to lighten a load. But why?" He searched further, uncovering a small leather satchel half buried nearby. Inside were papers in German, a few coins, and a letter addressed to Herr Heidegger, its seal broken. Holmes scanned it quickly, his brow furrowing. "This is from a woman in Leipzig," he said. "It speaks of a debt and a promise of aid, but the tone is cryptic. Heidegger had secrets, Watson, and they may have cost him dearly." I glanced around, the quarry shadows pressing in. "Do you think he betrayed the boy, or was he betrayed?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lantern's light. Heidelberg was no mere schoolmaster. His knowledge of the moor, his absence, this letter all suggests a man entangled in something deeper than pedagogy. The letter mentions a meeting at the quarry, set for last night. He came here, with or without the boy, but someone else was waiting. We searched the quarry further, finding no trace of Heidegger or Lord Arthur, but Holmes's attention lingered on a set of wagon tracks, their ruts deep and fresh, leading away from the quarry toward the north. "A cart, painted red," he said, pointing to a flake of paint caught on a rock. "It matches the scratch on the bicycle. Whoever took the boy used this vehicle, and it leads toward Holdernesse Hall." The night was now upon us, the moor a sea of darkness broken only by our lantern's feeble glow. Holmes stood silent, his mind racing through the web of clues. "The Duke's steward, Mr. Wilder, must be questioned," he said at length. "His name surfaced too readily in the Duke's account, and this cart may belong to the Hall's estate. Heidegger's secret is tied to the boy's fate, Watson, and I suspect the answer lies closer to the Duke than he cares to admit." As we made our way back toward the school, the moor's silence was broken only by the rustle of heather and the distant howl of the wind. I felt the weight of the mystery pressing heavier, the image of young Lord Arthur lost in this desolate wilderness haunting my thoughts. Holmes, however, was a beacon of resolve, his mind a steel trap closing around the truth. The German master's secret was but one piece of the puzzle, and I knew that Sherlock Holmes would not rest until every piece was in place. Chapter 7. The Ravine's Revelation. The Mackleton moor, under the cloak of a gathering night, seemed to pulse with an ancient, unyielding secrecy as Sherlock Holmes and I pressed onward from the abandoned quarry. The discovery of Lord Arthur's clothing and hair, Heidegger's cryptic letter, had deepened the mystery, casting a shadow that stretched beyond the desolate landscape to the very heart of Holdernesse Hall. The wind, now laced with the first drops of rain, whipped across the heather, and the air grew heavy with the scent of wet stone and earth. Holmes, his lantern casting a feeble glow, moved with a relentless determination, his eyes fixed on the faint wagon tracks that led northward, their red paint a silent echo of the bicycle's scratch. "These tracks are our guide, Watson," he said, his voice cutting through the moan of the wind. "The cart, with its distinctive hue, suggests a vehicle from the Hall's estate. Whoever took the boy planned their route with care, avoiding the main paths. We must follow, but with caution, for we are closing in." The trail wound through a maze of gorse and rocky outcrops, descending into a deeper ravine than the one we had explored earlier. Its walls, steep and jagged, loomed like the ramparts of some forgotten fortress, and the narrow stream at its base gurgled softly, its sound swallowed by the moor's vast silence. Holmes paused at the ravine's edge, his lantern sweeping the ground, where the wagon tracks mingled with fresher Mark's boot prints, heavy and uneven, and a single delicate impression that could only belong to a child. "Here," Holmes said, crouching to examine the mud. Lord Arthur's footprint again, but fainter, as though he walked lightly or was carried. "And these," he pointed to the boot prints, their soles scored with a distinctive notch. "The same man from the earlier ravine, I wager. But see this." He directed the lantern to a patch of disturbed earth, where a glint of metal caught. The light, he brushed away the soil, revealing a pocket watch. Its case dented, but engraved with the initials H.H. Herr Heidegger, I said, my breath catching. He was here. Then Holmes opened the watch, its hands frozen at 9:30. "Last night, during the storm," he said, his voice grim. "This was no accident, Watson." The watch was dropped in haste, perhaps during a struggle. He turned it over, noting a faint smear of blood on the casing. Not enough for a mortal wound, but enough to suggest violence. I felt a chill that owed nothing to the rain now falling in earnest. "Do you think Heidegger is dead?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, his lantern casting shadows across his angular face. "Possible, but not certain. The blood is minimal, and the watch may have been planted to mislead. We must press on." The ravine narrowed, its walls closing in until we were forced to walk single file, the stream soaking our boots. Holmes's lantern flickered, but his focus never wavered, his eyes tracing every mark in the mud. At a bend in the ravine, he stopped. Abruptly, his light falling on a gruesome sight, a man's body, sprawled face down in the shallow water, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I knelt beside it, my medical instincts overriding my horror, and turned the body over. It was Herr Heidegger, his bearded face pale and lifeless, his skull fractured by a single, savage blow. "Murder," I said, my voice hoarse. "Struck from behind, likely with a heavy stone." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "The angle confirms it. He was killed here, not long after 9, if the watch is accurate." The killer was strong, precise, and familiar with this terrain. He examined the ground nearby, where the boot prints with the notched sole were deeper, as though the killer had stood over his victim. Our cloaked figure, perhaps, but why kill Heidegger? Was he an accomplice turned liability, or a victim of his own scheme? I glanced at the body, its eyes staring blankly at the sky. And Lord Arthur, no sign of him here. Holmes's gaze swept the ravine. The boy was moved again. See these marks? He pointed to faint scuffs leading up the opposite bank. The cart was brought here, and the child was loaded onto it. The killer took pains to hide his tracks, but the rain has betrayed him. We climbed the bank, following the scuffs to a point where the wagon tracks resumed. Their ruts deeper now, as though bearing a heavier load. Holmes traced them with his lantern, his face set in a mask of concentration. The trail leads toward a cluster of hills, he said. There is an old shepherd's hut there, not unlike the one we found earlier. It is our best chance to find the boy. The journey to the hut was a trial, the rain now a steady downpour, turning the moor into a quagmire. My boots sank with each step, but Holmes pressed on, his lantern a beacon in the darkness. The hut, when we reached it, was a crumbling relic, its stone walls moss-covered and its roof leaking. Holmes pushed open the door, his revolver drawn, and I followed, my heart pounding with the hope and fear of what we might find. Inside, a faint whimper broke the silence. In the corner, bound with coarse rope, sat Lord Arthur Saltire, his fair hair matted with mud, his eyes wide with terror but unharmed. Beside him stood a man, tall and wiry, with a face hardened by years of resentment, James Wilder, the Duke's steward, his hand clutching a knife that gleamed in the lantern's light. "Stay back," Wilder snarled, his voice raw with desperation. "One step, and the boy suffers." Holmes lowered his revolver, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Have nowhere to run, Mr. Wilder. The game is over." Wilder's eyes darted, his grip tightening on the knife. "You know nothing, Holmes. This is bigger than you can imagine." Holmes's smile was cold. "I imagine a great deal, sir. Step away from the boy, and we shall discuss it." The tension hung like a storm cloud, but Holmes's steady gaze seemed to sap Wilder's resolve. With a curse, he dropped the knife, and I rushed to untie Lord Arthur, who clung to me, trembling but unhurt. Holmes secured Wilder's wrists with a length of rope, his movements swift and precise. "The ravine has revealed its truth, Watson," Holmes said, as we prepared to escort our prisoners back to the school. "But the motive remains. Tale, I suspect, will cast a long shadow over Holdernesse Hall." The rain fell harder as we left the hut. The moor's secrets laid bare, but its darkness unbroken. Lord Arthur was safe, but I knew the final pieces of this puzzle lay with the Duke, and Holmes would not rest until they were uncovered. Chapter 8. The motive unraveled. The rain-swept moor seemed to hold its breath as Sherlock. Holmes and I emerged from the shepherd's hut, young Lord Arthur Saltire clinging to my side, his small frame shivering but unharmed. James Wilder, the Duke's steward, walked before us, his wrists bound, his face a mask of sullen defiance. The lantern's feeble light cast long shadows across the heather, and the distant towers of Holdernesse Hall loomed through the mist, a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded on this desolate stage. Holmes, his revolver still in hand, moved with a quiet intensity, his mind already piecing together the final threads of the mystery that had begun with Dr. Huxtable's urgent visit to Baker Street. We made our way back to the Priory School. The boy wrapped in my overcoat, his eyes wide but his voice silent, as though the terror of his ordeal had robbed him of speech. Wilder, too, said nothing, his gaze fixed on the ground, though I sensed a storm of emotion beneath his hardened exterior. The school's gates appeared through the rain, and Dr. Huxtable, alerted by a stable boy, met us with a cry of relief. "Thank God," he exclaimed, rushing to Lord Arthur. "You found him." Holmes's expression remained impassive. "The boy is safe, Dr. Huxtable, but the matter is not yet concluded. Send for the Duke at once, and have Mr. Wilder secured. He has much to answer for." We were ushered into the headmaster's study, where a fire was hastily lit to warm the trembling child. Lord Arthur, though shaken, showed the resilience of youth, accepting a cup of tea with trembling hands. Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the flickering firelight, his eyes never leaving Wilder, who sat bound in a chair, his jaw set in defiance. The Duke of Holdernesse arrived within the hour, his carriage rattling to a stop. Outside, he burst into the room, his face a tumult of relief and anguish as he knelt beside his son, clasping him tightly. "Arthur, my boy," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You're safe." Holmes stepped forward, his tone calm but commanding. "Your Grace, the reunion is heartening, but we must address the cause of this calamity. Mr. Wilder, I believe, holds the key to the motive." The Duke rose, his eyes flickering with unease as he glanced at his steward. "Wilder, what has he to do with this?" Holmes's smile was thin, his gaze piercing. "Everything, Your Grace. Allow me to elucidate." He paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice measured but relentless. Lord Arthur was taken from his dormitory under cover of the storm, not by force but by persuasion or coercion. The bicycle, belonging to Herr Heidegger, was used to spirit him across the moor to a ravine, where Heidegger met his ender, single blow to the skull, delivered by Mr. Wilder here. Wilder's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "You've no proof," Holmes continued, undeterred. "The proof lies in the tracks, the red paint from a cart belonging to your estate, and the notched sole of your boots, which match the prints. Found beside Heidegger's body, you lured the boy from the school, perhaps with a promise or a threat, and Heidegger, your accomplice, provided the means of escape. But he became a liability. Perhaps he demanded more than you were willing to pay, and so you silenced him in the ravine." The Duke's face paled, his hands gripping the back of a chair. "Wilder, is this true?" Wilder's defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging. "It was for you," he said, his voice low and bitter. "For the family." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "For the family, or for yourself? Let us lay bare the truth. You, Mr. Wilder, are no mere steward. You are the Duke's illegitimate son, born of a liaison before his marriage to the Duchess. Your existence has been a closely guarded secret, known only to a few, but it has festered in your heart, has it not? You saw Lord Arthur, the legitimate heir, as a barrier to your own ambitions." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. The Duke's face was ashen, his eyes fixed on Wilder with a mixture of horror and guilt. "James," he whispered, "how could you?" Wilder's voice rose, raw with years of suppressed resentment. "You gave me a place in your household, but never a name. I managed your estates, served you faithfully, yet I was nothing compared to him." He gestured toward Lord Arthur, who shrank back. "I thought if he were gone just for a time you'd see my worth. I meant to ransom him, to secure my place, my inheritance." Holmes's voice cut through the confession like a blade. And Heidegger, what was his role? Wilder's gaze dropped. He owed debts in Leipzig. I promised him money to help me take the boy. He used his bicycle, knew the moor's paths. But he grew greedy, threatened to expose me. I had no choice. The Duke sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. My God, James, what have you done? Holmes turned to the Duke, his tone softening but firm. Your Grace, your silence on this matter, your reluctance to speak of your household, this tragedy. Had you been forthright, we might have reached the boy sooner. Heidegger's blood is on Wilder's hands, but the shadow of your secret lies over this affair. I looked at Lord Arthur, who clung to his father, and felt a pang of pity for the Duke, whose private shame had birthed such a scheme. Holmes, however, was relentless. The local constabulary will be summoned, Your Grace. Mr. Wilder must face justice, but I trust you will ensure the boy's safety and the Duchess's peace. The scandal can be contained if you act with discretion. The Duke nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I will do whatever is necessary. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. As Wilder was led away by Huxtable's staff to await the police, Holmes and I prepared to return to the school for the night. The rain had ceased, and the moor lay silent under a sky pricked with stars. In the carriage, Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling about his sharp features. A sordid tale, Watson, he said, his voice low. Family secrets are the darkest of motives, breeding resentment that festers into crime. The Duke's silence was as much a catalyst as Wilder's ambition. I nodded, my thoughts on the boy, now safe, but forever marked by this ordeal. Will you write this up, Holmes? He smiled faintly, his eyes on the distant lights of the school, perhaps, Watson. But some truths are best left to the moor's silence. The end.